When a child runs away from home and the mother loses control of the situation, the court is forced to intervene. Is it a teenage rebellion or a cry for help? Will the mother be able to regain her daughter's trust before the court's decision becomes final? Temporary separation or forever lost family ties, the answer will determine this emotional and tense process where every word can change the fate. Chapter 1. Filing a Claim. The Chicago Circuit Family Court was overcrowded. Lawyers walked nervously in the corridors, mothers with children waited for their turn, and bailiffs carefully watched everything that was happening. There was a tense silence in the courtroom where the Baker v. Anderson trial was about to begin. The plaintiff, James Baker, sat at the table with his attorney, going over the documents. His face was impenetrable, only his gaze betrayed fatigue and inner tension. A few minutes later, the defendant, Olivia Anderson, entered the hall. She looked alarmed, but tried to control herself. A tall, slender woman with dark hair in a sharp business suit, she took a seat next to her lawyer, feeling James' eyes on her. She knew that look well. Once there was love in him, then disappointment, now cold determination. The bailiff loudly announced the beginning of the hearing. Judge Hamilton is in session. I ask everyone to stand up. The judge entered the hall, a middle-aged woman with piercing eyes and a serious expression on her face. She quickly looked around the audience, stopped at the lawyers, and said, "Good day. Today we consider the case of Baker v. Anderson. Plaintiff James Baker, defendant Olivia Anderson. It is about limiting the mother's parental rights regarding their common daughter, 13-year-old Sarah Baker. The plaintiff seeks custody of the child's grandmother, Helen Baker." The judge opened a folder with documents, made a few marks, and looked up. "Let's start with the plaintiff. Mr. Baker, you have the floor." James took a deep breath and stood up. His voice was calm but confident. "Your Honor, I am not filing this lawsuit to get revenge on Olivia. My only goal is the well-being of our daughter. Sarah is going through a difficult time, and I believe that living with her mother is dangerous for her right now, not physically, but emotionally. She does not accept Olivia's new marriage. Her behavior becomes increasingly aggressive. She runs away from home, which creates risks for her safety. Therefore, I believe that the best solution is to give temporary custody to the grandmother, where Sarah will feel more at ease." Olivia, who had been silent until now, suddenly burst into flames. "This is absurd. You are taking my child away just because I got married. You were always against me having a personal life." Her voice shook with emotion, and Judge Hamilton raised her hand to silence her. "Miss Anderson, you will have the opportunity to express your position. I ask you to follow the order." The woman pursed her lips, holding back tears. Her lawyer leaned over and whispered softly, "Take it easy. We will have time to answer." The judge turned her gaze to James's lawyer. "Continue." "We have evidence that Sarah has run away from home more than once," he said, pulling out the papers. 3 cases in the last 6 months. Twice the police found her with friends and once with her grandmother. All these situations were accompanied by scandals and the girl's refusal to return home. The judge looked over the papers and then turned to Olivia. "Miss Anderson, is that true?" Olivia clenched her fingers in her knees as if trying to keep her body from shaking. "Your Honor, this is an exaggeration. Yes, Sarah has spent the night away from home a few times, but that doesn't mean she doesn't want to live with me. It's just that she has a hard time experiencing change. I am sure that we will be able to find a common language." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "Okay, let's continue. Mrs. Baker, are you here too? Are you ready to testify?" An elderly woman with kind eyes and neatly styled silver hair sat on the witness stand. Helen Baker, Sarah's grandmother, rose cautiously. "Yes, Your Honor. I just want to help my granddaughter." The judge marked the case and, looking at both parties, said, "Okay, we will hear from you at the next meeting. Enough for today." The bailiff announced the end of the meeting, but everyone present understood that this was only the beginning of a long and intense struggle. Chapter 2. Position of the Plaintiff. The next day's court hearing began with the same official announcement. Judge Hamilton took her place on the stand and immediately turned her gaze to James Baker. Mr. Baker, today you will have the opportunity to present your arguments in detail. You have a word. James stood up, straightened his shoulders. He looked calm, but the judge could see his fingers slightly gripping the edge of the table. Your Honor, before I begin, I want to emphasize once again, I do not seek to take my daughter away from her mother forever. I just want Sarah to be able to live in an emotionally stable environment until things get better. He paused, as if collecting his thoughts, and continued. My parenting was not easy. I didn't live with Olivia after Sarah was born, but I always accepted my responsibility and supported my daughter. I paid for her education, provided everything necessary, and saw her as often as circumstances allowed. But the last few months have seriously worried me. James glanced at Olivia. She sat motionless, her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze directed somewhere to the side, as if she was trying not to react. When Olivia married Eric, Sarah immediately made it clear that she did not accept him as part of her family. She felt like a stranger in her own home. James pursed his lips, his voice deepening for a moment. At first, she became withdrawn, stopped answering my calls, and then she started running away. This is no longer just a children's riot, it is a cry for help. He opened the file in front of him and pulled out a few sheets. These are the police reports about Sarah's disappearance. 3 cases in half a year. Each time she was found in different places, but she always said one thing: she did not want to go home. She is not afraid of physical violence, but of a life that no longer feels like hers. The judge took the documents, looked at them, and nodded. What do you propose as a solution to the situation, Mr. Baker? Temporary transfer of care to the grandmother. Helen has always been a close person for Sarah, and my daughter herself has repeatedly said that she feels calmer in her house. This is not a separation forever. I want Olivia to be able to resolve her family issues and Sarah to find balance. Did you communicate with your daughter after these incidents? What does she herself think about it? Asked the judge. James sighed. I tried. She has become silent, often avoids talking, but when it comes to her return home, she stubbornly refuses. The judge turned her gaze to Olivia. Mrs. Anderson, your attorney will speak next, but briefly for now. What do you say to that? Olivia finally raised her head. Her voice trembled with suppressed emotions. Sarah is my daughter. She is a part of me. I know she's angry now that she doesn't want to listen to me, but I'm sure I can win her trust back. I just need time. The judge nodded, took a note, and adjourned before hearing the defendant's side. The atmosphere in the hall was tense. Everyone understands that this is only the beginning of a complex process that will not have simple solutions. Chapter 3: Mother's Protection. After the break, the court session resumed. Olivia Anderson appeared composed, although the judge noticed her clenching her hands from time to time as if trying to control her emotions. Judge Hamilton looked at her attorney, Jonathan Reeves, and gestured for him to speak. Mr. Reeves, now it's your turn to present the defendant's position. You have a word. The lawyer, a man in a dark suit with a cold-blooded expression on his face, stood up and, holding a briefcase in his hands, came closer to the judge. His voice sounded even, confident, without any hesitation. Your Honor, before we proceed to the arguments, I want to emphasize, this process is not only a legal issue, but also a moral test for everyone present. We are not just talking about legal status, but about a mother who loves her daughter above all else and does not want to lose her. Olivia slowly raised her head. There was a mixture of pain and determination in her eyes. She gripped the edge of the table with her fingers, as if it were the last support in this stormy sea of court proceedings. Mrs. Anderson is a caring mother who has raised Sarah on her own since she was born. She devoted her life to her daughter, provided her with everything she needed, and never shirked responsibility. Reeves walked over to the evidence table and picked up some documents. Here are the certificates from school. Sarah has always been a diligent student, attended clubs, and had no behavior problems until recently. This does not look like the story of a child raised in unhealthy conditions. He placed the documents on the table in front of the judge, then looked at the plaintiff. Mr. Baker says Sarah started running away after her mother got married. But could this not be a natural reaction of a teenager who is going through changes? It is difficult for children to accept new people in their lives, especially at this age. The judge looked at the documents, nodded, and turned her gaze to Olivia. Miss Anderson, is there anything you would like to add? Olivia rose slowly. Her voice sounded shaky but firm. Your Honor, it hurts me to hear that they are trying to expose me as a mother who cannot take care of her own daughter. I don't deny that Sarah is having a hard time with my marriage. But that doesn't mean I'm a bad mother or that she shouldn't live with me. She paused, catching her breath. Yes, once I lost control and hit her. It was a mistake. But it hurts me terribly that this one event can become a reason to take my daughter away from me. I am not the wonderful father you see in the movies, but I am the one who has been with her all these years. I am the one who worried about her when she was sick, who helped her with her homework, who loves her more than anything. She was silent for a moment before looking directly at James. Your Honor, Mr. Baker has been absent for most of Sarah's life. He supported her materially, but not emotionally. He doesn't know how hard it was for me. He doesn't know how I stayed up at night worrying when she was late coming home. Now he wants to act as a savior, taking her away from me when she's at an emotional crossroads. This is not fair. Judge Hamilton tapped her pen thoughtfully on the table. Of course. Miss Anderson, are you willing to accept a temporary transfer of custody to Grandma? Olivia shook her head curtly. No, Your Honor. I believe that I can handle the situation on my own. I'm just asking you to give me a chance. The judge nodded and made a note in her papers. Good. We will hear more witnesses before making a decision. The court announces a break. Chapter 4, Grandmother's Testimony. The court session resumed after a break, and the atmosphere in the courtroom remained tense. Judge Hamilton looked over her notes before turning her gaze to an elderly woman sitting in the front row, watching the proceedings intently. She was dressed in a light, elegant dress, her gray hair was neatly combed, and her face showed weariness mixed with determination. Miss Baker, the judge asked, are you ready to testify? Helen Baker rose slowly, ran her hand up her skirt as if smoothing out imaginary creases, and walked over to the witness stand. Her movements were leisurely but confident. She looked at her sister-in-law, Olivia, then at James, and then at the judge. Yes, Your Honor, she answered in a calm but firm voice. Do you swear to tell the truth and only the truth? Asked the bailiff. I swear, she said without hesitation. The judge signaled to start. James' attorney, who was representing the plaintiff, stepped forward. Miss Baker, you're Sarah Baker's grandmother, correct? Yes, she nodded. I am her grandmother, and if I may add, I have always been not just a relative for her, but also a friend. Did you often spend time with your granddaughter? Helen smiled, though there was more sadness than joy in that smile. Of course, she spent a lot of time with me, especially when she was younger. Even when she grew up, she often came to me because she knew that here she would always be listened to, given advice, and not forced to do what she did not like. The lawyer nodded and changed his tone to a more serious one. Miss Baker, are you aware that Sarah has run away from home several times? Did she spend the night at your place? Helen held her breath for a moment before answering. Yes, it happened for the first time 3 months ago. She called me late at night and asked me to pick her up. I came right away. She cried, said that she could not stay there any longer. She felt like a stranger in her own home. Someone else? Asked the lawyer. Why did she say that? Helen looked cautiously at Olivia, who was silently staring at the table in front of her, then replied, she could not accept her mother's new husband. She didn't feel like she could trust him, even though he seemed to be trying to get along with her. But Sarah is a stubborn girl, and if she has decided something, it is not so easy to convince her otherwise. She believed that she had been replaced, that she was no longer loved as before. It's painful to hear, but that's how she felt. There was silence in the hall. Judge Hamilton leaned forward. Miss Baker, do you think Sarah will be safe if she stays with her mother? Helen took a deep breath and, enduring a pause, answered. Your Honor, I have no doubt that Olivia loves her daughter, but I can see that Sarah is unhappy now. If she continues to live in the same environment, she will start to run away again, perhaps this time somewhere further away. I don't want to risk her safety. I'm not saying Olivia is a bad mother, but now Sarah needs stability, and if living with me temporarily will help her find balance, then I am ready to take on this responsibility. The judge made a note in her papers and looked at Olivia. Miss Anderson, do you want to ask the witness a question? Olivia slowly raised her head. Challenge and pain were read in her gaze at the same time. She got up from her chair and, turning to Helen, in a voice mixed with irritation and entreaty, asked, "Why do you want to take my daughter away from me? Why don't you support me and instead side with James? I'm her mother too. Did you forget that?" Helen lowered her eyes, as if it was difficult to look at the crying face of her daughter-in-law. "Olivia, I don't want to take Sarah away from you. I want her to be happy. If that means giving her some space to figure out her feelings, that's better than forcing her to stay where she doesn't want to be." The judge intervened to prevent an emotional outburst. "I think that's enough for today. We heard from Miss Baker. Next, we will move on to the conclusions of social services. The court announces a break." Chapter 5. Conclusions of Social Services. Judge Hamilton checked her watch and signaled the bailiff to announce adjournment. Silence reigned in the hall again. Only the slight crackle of the microphone and rustling of papers disturbed the tense atmosphere. "Miss Davis," the judge said to the representative of Social Services, "you have the floor to present conclusions regarding this case." The social worker, Sarah Davis, calmly stood up, holding a folder of notes in front of her. She was well aware that now her words could affect the lives of everyone present in this hall. "Your Honor, after a thorough consideration of the circumstances of the case and interviews with the child, her parents and grandmother, the social service came to the following conclusions." She opened the first page of the report and ran her eyes over the notes. "Sarah Baker, a 13-year-old girl, is currently going through a serious emotional crisis. The main trigger for her was the remarriage of her mother, Mrs. Olivia Anderson. We have identified several key areas of concern." Davis turned the page and continued. "First of all, Sarah has repeatedly stated that she does not feel comfortable in the new family situation. She perceives the appearance of her stepfather as a threat to her place in her mother's life. She believes that she has begun to be ignored, that her voice no longer matters. This led to a sharp change in behavior. She became withdrawn, irritated, and began to run away from home." In the courtroom, Olivia pursed her lips, trying not to react. She knew that any word could be used against her now. Secondly, although we found no evidence of systematic physical violence, the fact of one case of physical abuse by the mother is recognized by all parties. Davis turned her gaze to the judge. "Mrs. Anderson admitted that in a fit of emotional breakdown, she hit her daughter after her next escape. Sarah remembers this moment with pain, seeing it as proof that she is no longer loved." James Baker tilted his head slightly, but did not say a word. His lawyer only made a quick note of the moment in his notes. "Thirdly, we have learned that Sarah has repeatedly expressed her desire to live with her grandmother, Mrs. Helen Baker. Grandma plays a significant role in her life and is an important emotional support for her. During the interview, Sarah directly stated that she feels safer and calmer in her grandmother's house." Davis paused, allowing the audience to absorb what was said. Then she moved on to the final part of the report. "Based on the collected data, our service believes that the temporary transfer of guardianship to the grandmother, Mrs. Helen Baker, is the optimal solution in this situation. This will allow Sarah to stabilize her emotional state, avoid further conflicts, and get the necessary psychological support. We recommend setting a period of 6 months, after which the decision should be reviewed and the dynamics of changes evaluated." There was a slight rustling in the hall. One of the lawyers was turning over papers. Judge Hamilton looked at Olivia again. "Miss Anderson, do you have any objection to this conclusion?" Olivia balled her fingers into a fist and then took a deep breath. "Your Honor," she began, trying to speak calmly, "I do not deny that Sarah and I are going through a difficult period now. But I don't think that handing custody over to my grandmother is the right decision. I am her mother, and I don't want to lose my baby, not even for 6 months. The judge shook her head. Miss Anderson, this is a temporary measure for your daughter's well-being. If you can build a relationship, she can come home. Olivia pursed her lips as if trying to hold back tears. She looked at Helen, who was sitting motionless, an expression of sadness and understanding on her face. The grandmother did not want to hurt her daughter-in-law, but she was sure that she was making the right choice. The judge looked up. This concludes the hearing of the conclusions of the social services. Next, we proceed to the discussion of a possible amicable solution. The court announces a break. Chapter 6. Court Agreement. Judge Hamilton announced a break, but the tension in the courtroom did not subside. Olivia sat with her hands clasped in her lap, trying to hide the trembling of her fingers. James maintained a calm indifference, but his eyes betrayed intense anticipation. Helen Baker sighed cautiously, looking at her daughter-in-law with an expression of restrained pity. The judge took her seat again and briefly looked at the parties. After the conclusions of the social services, it became obvious that the situation requires an immediate solution. The court is considering the possibility of concluding a settlement agreement between the parties. This will avoid further litigation and allow you to find a compromise that will be best for the child. She fell silent for a moment, giving the audience an opportunity to understand her words. Then she looked at lawyer James. Mr. Randolph, is the plaintiff willing to consider a settlement? The lawyer looked at James briefly and nodded. Yes, Your Honor. We offer the following terms. Temporary custody of Sarah is given to Mrs. Helen Baker for a period of 6 months. Olivia Anderson has the right to visit her daughter unhindered and to maintain regular contact with her. During this period, the mother undertakes to undergo a course of family counseling in order to restore a trusting relationship with her daughter. At the end of the term, the court will re-examine the situation and make a decision regarding the possible return of the child to the mother. Olivia raised her head sharply. Tears flashed in her eyes. 6 months. This is too long. Her voice dropped to a whisper. You are taking my daughter away from me, as if I were a stranger to her. Miss Anderson, the judge raised her hand, silencing her. I understand your emotions, but the decision is made based on the best interests of the child. Olivia slowly clenched her fists. She turned her gaze to Helen, as if seeking support or at least an explanation. Do you want that? She whispered. Do you really want to take her away from me? Helen shook her head. I want Sarah to be happy, Olivia. And if that means giving her some space, then yes, I'm willing to take on that responsibility. The silence in the hall became almost unbearable. The judge gave Olivia a few seconds before continuing. Miss Anderson, do you agree to the terms of the settlement agreement? Olivia closed her eyes as if trying to find the strength to accept the inevitable. When she looked at the judge again, her gaze hardened. If this is the only option. She paused as if she herself did not believe her own words. Yes, I agree. The judge marked the case and addressed the parties. Since both parties agreed, the court approves the settlement agreement. The custody of Sarah Baker is temporarily transferred to Mrs. Helen Baker for 6 months. During this period, the mother will have unlimited visitation and communication rights. After the deadline, the court will review the situation. She raised the gavel and made an official strike. The case is temporarily closed. Olivia didn't get up right away. She sat staring at the table, as if not fully aware of what had just happened. Helen cautiously reached out to touch her shoulder, but the woman recoiled sharply. Not now, she whispered. James left the hall in silence. His face remained impenetrable, though inside he was relieved. He did what he thought was right. But was it right for everyone? The bailiffs began to disperse those present, but the weight of the decision that had just been made remained in the air. This was not the end of the story. It was only a temporary solution that could change the lives of each of them. Chapter 7. Consequences of the decision. The sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon as everyone left the courtroom. The air seemed thicker, as if saturated with unspoken words and tension that had not dissipated even after the decision had been made. Olivia stood by the door, clutching her bag in her hands so that her fingers turned white. She did not leave immediately, as if hoping that someone would come to her and tell her that it was just a bad dream. But this did not happen. James had already disappeared down the corridor without looking back. Helen approached her slowly, cautiously, as if approaching a wild animal that might break out of its cage at any moment. "Olivia," she said softly. "What?" Olivia's voice was even, but cold. She didn't want to look at her because she was afraid she wouldn't be able to hide the pain in her own eyes. "I am not your enemy," continued Helen. "It's hard for all of us, but especially for Sarah. She didn't want it to go this far." Olivia turned sharply to her. "I know she didn't want to, but it doesn't change anything. She will now live with you, and I will stay away." Helen sighed. She understood that there were no right words to comfort Olivia right now. "She won't be without you," she said. "You can come as much as you want. This is not a separation forever. Do you really think that after 6 months she will want to come back?" In Olivia's voice, there was a barely perceptible note of desperation. "She will get used to you, to your house, to the peace that I don't have now. And then what? Will they just tell me she's better off there and I'll lose her forever?" Helen didn't know what to say. "It's up to you," she finally said, "from how you use this time." Olivia laughed, but there was no joy in that laugh. She shook her head bitterly, feeling that any conversation was pointless now. "Tell her I love her," she said quietly, and then simply turned and walked away quickly, not allowing Helen to answer. That same evening, Sarah was sitting in her room in her grandmother's house. She stared out the window, watching the evening lights spill over the street. Her favorite backpack was in the corner, not yet unpacked. She didn't want to feel like this was her new home. Helen came into the room carrying a cup of warm tea. She put it on the table and sat down next to it. "How are you?" Sarah shrugged. "I don't know. I thought that I would be happy if I left there. But are you sad?" Helen finished for her. Sarah nodded. She felt her grandmother lightly touch her shoulder. "It's okay, dear. Change is always difficult." Sarah was silent for a long time and then asked, "Was she very upset?" Helen thought for a moment and then answered honestly, "Yes, but she loves you, and she will not give up." Sarah pursed her lips, trying to hold back the tears. She didn't want her grandmother to see her cry. I don't know how to fix it," she said quietly. Helen smiled and patted her head gently. "You have 6 months to figure it out, honey, and I will help you." Sarah didn't answer, just stared at the window again as if looking for an answer there. But inside, she already knew that this was just the beginning of a new test. And what do you think? Was the judge's verdict fair? Write your thoughts in the comments below the video. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next crazier thing. Next crazier thing. Next crazy